Hello, beautiful community. You're about to torture yourselves, I hope, for about 15 to 20 minutes. So, obviously, all my love and thoughts are with you for this self induced, excruciating procedure. The Spectator ran an interview somebody did for them with Daria Dugin, the intellectual entertainer, geopolitical activist and entrepreneur. I don't mean entrepreneur in the literal sense. I mean somebody who entrepreneurially uses ideas about politics to build up their profile. And of course, he's a kind of a mock spiritualist, a mock metaphysician. The interview got criticized for whitewashing Dugin, and we'll look later on at why that's actually a fair criticism. But first, let's bring ourselves into focus on the fascinating view Dugin has of Putin and Putin has of Dugin. But even before that, let me just do something instantly that I didn't do in the thread that I've written for us here, which is just a kind of immediate way to react to the interview. Here's to the interview article. Here's how it begins. It is by Edward Stawiarski, who seems to have had interviews and conversations with Dugin in the past. Is the invasion of Ukraine a holy war? If that is how Putin sees it, it might have something to do with the ideas of Alexander Dugin, a former anti-communist who is touted by some to be the Russian president's favorite philosopher. He is described as a Rasputin-style mystic, a comparison aided by his beard. While the level of influence Dugin has on Putin is disputed, there is no question that this unapologetic supporter of Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, brutal's my insertion, has had a major impact on Russian intellectual and political circles. No. If I'm an editor, that is not good enough. If you're writing me an article about Dugin, you're not going to Trumpicize me. Some people say he's very influential. Other people don't think he is. A lot of people say that he's a tremendous influence. He's like a Rasputin, and even more than a Rasputin. But other people really don't recognize that. But some people do. If you are kindly coming to fix my washing machine, I don't want you to say, your washing machine has a reputation for being very, very broken. But a lot of people say it's going to work brilliantly for a long time. I'm so grateful that you are here. Could you tell me if you think the thing is broken and maybe I need to get a new one, or maybe you think we can fix it? I'd be so grateful for your view. Well, many people talk about your washing machine, but some people, but other people, no. If you're doing a piece on Dugin, for goodness sake, you've got to express a judgment, in my opinion, about his degree of influence. And if you don't have a view on that, you probably shouldn't be interviewing Dugin. And I think this author clearly does have a view on it. And that view, I would guess, is that Dugin is very influential. That is wrong. But I'd love it to be expressed. As an editorial policy, you've got to ask for that, right? This guy is doing a piece for us. Let's also have not just his piece, but his view that Dugin is important. So say it. And then the piece, not at all badly, sketches out some of Dugin's position, discusses the assassination of his daughter, and talks about Dugin's sense that the West is destroying itself through its own liberalism, something that we could spend more time actually hearing Dugin speak about. That would not be unreasonable. And the piece emphasizes the mystical aspect of Dugin's thought, and the mystical aspect of the war, perhaps for Putin too, but the challenge is in linking Dugin's and Putin's mysticism. As we'll find out in a moment, Dugin's mysticism sort of runs ahead of the carriage and tries to align itself with Putin's mysticism. It has a different source. It's got nothing to do with Dugin. Okay, let's go. What are the ethics? And this is actually a fascinating question for us. What are the ethics of talking to people like Dugin? If we're working for a paper, we're working for a TV channel, we're working for a magazine, political magazine. Do we talk? Do we not? And how do we talk? That's where we're going to come to. But first, let's quickly ground ourselves on Dugin. It's going to be excruciating. Brace yourselves. For Dugin, Putin has some of the right form, but none of the right content. It's a form-content distinction he makes with Putin. Putin's politics, Dugin thinks, is in the end just about Putin. It's not about what Russia needs. However, Dugin thinks Putin is necessary. For Dugin, Putin is not so much a necessary evil, but a pivotal part of a transitional stage that will eventually culminate in Russia becoming whatever it needs to become. Notice how vague this stuff is. And transition is the key word here. For Dugin, permanent Putinism would basically be just as bad as Western liberalism. They're both catastrophes in his mind, if they're to be the permanent state for Russia. Well, what is Russia meant to be then, Mr. Dugin? And here I think we bump into Dugin's extraordinary, to put it mildly, justification for war, which has many parts, but I'm going to concentrate it into three. Dugin thinks that Russia must sever itself from the West. Dugin thinks Russia must develop its true identity, which it does not yet have. And then 3, 1 and 2, is only really doable if Russia is appropriately geographically unconstrained. And here there are resonances of Lebensraum. Gets more disturbing. The destruction of contemporary Ukraine as an outcome, but also as a process. As a process. Is the site on which Russia, for Dugin, will develop what is its true social and political form. But what the hell is going on here? Why are we being so vague? And I think the vagueness is because Dugin's position is intentionally vague. The ideas that Russia needs, Dugin thinks, still need to be constructed. And no one, including him, can know what they will be. So Dugin believes that the war is part of a process of collective self-realization, right? We're going to take the livelihoods and the lives of some innocent civilians and going to self-realize ourselves. That's really good. So the war is part of a process of collective self-realization for Russia that will eventually lead to the construction of Russia's political identity. This is why numerous comments from Dugin and from his late daughter Daria cast Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine as a mystical act of creation. Take this quote, for example. Just think of how this is just a parroting of Daddy to a good extent, and how tragic it is that this is such a derivative parroting of Daddy. This is what his daughter wrote not long before the end of her life. Philosophy is born there, in eastern Ukraine, where there is death and life, oneself and other. For me, Novorossiya is a space with philosophical significance, a space that births an empire. And thanks to this frontier horizon, Russia can exist as Russia. Now, what does Putin think of all of this? I suppose before even saying that, Let's just point out what an elementary philosophical mistake this is. Because that's not how the connection between practice and reflection works. Ideas don't arise because somebody announces that they need to arise. Ideas need to arise in a certain kind of context, right? Dugin thinks that there can be a process of creation that can start once the country becomes appropriately geographically unconstrained. And there'll be some people creating this. That's not how it works. Ideas that inform the shape of a political culture are about moments of cultural moment that come, that are independent of the will, that are independent of any decision anybody is making. You can intervene in them in various ways, but they are large, complex, rather pliant, but not entirely pliant shapes that come and go, and one has to negotiate with them. Moreover, even if one were to try to inflect them by positively making a decision that one will inflect them, one needs the right circumstances. The idea that the sort of degrading and shut down shop that is Putin's Russia, that's any kind of a home for the development of any kind of ideas, is ludicrous, especially as the most creative people are running from the country, not in quite the same numbers as after the revolution, but at the beginning of the 20th century, but in numbers that are sort of bordering on being 50% of the same scale. What does Putin think of all of this? Putin thinks this is just silly, eccentric nonsense. And you can sense that, for instance, when Putin engages with the elder fellow traveler of Dugin, Mr. Prokhanov. And he has interacted with Putin a few times during the war. And Putin always responds with a bit of condescension and a smirk about the sort of, intellectual silliness of it. But then in the end lands on sort of amiable, obligatory niceties directed at Mr. Prokhanov. And that's how he thinks of Dugin too. Putin doesn't read the sorts of books Dugin writes. We'll eventually find out what Putin reads, but we can be confident that Dugin ain't it. And I think we can also be confident that even though Putin is always ready to pull a quote from Ivan Ilyin, it's safe to say he doesn't read Ivan Ilyin either. But it's true that there is a mystical element to Putin's motivation for war. But this comes from Putin's personal relationships and conversations. Now, if Dugin's mysticism is a sort of mock mysticism, it is spectacularly contrived. Putin's mysticism is a kind of a budget add-on mysticism. If Putin is crossing a river on a raft, and the raft is being built for him, and you tell him, Mr. Putin, would you like to bathe in some elk blood before you cross the river? He'd say, no, let's just get on with it. But if you point out, well, look, the raft actually needs to be tested for 10 minutes anyway, so we've got time. So do you want to douse your testicles in elk blood, Mr. Putin? And he would then say, well, better be safe than sorry. I think we'll go for it. We've got the time anyway. Douse me right now. It's a kind of add-on. We've done this, we've done that, we've done all the things we should do that are continuous with a naturalistic understanding of the world. If we have space and energy and time, let's throw in some occult things too, So Putin would never think that engaging in these thoughts and maybe even rituals could tilt the direction of the war. But if there is space for them, why not do them anyway and see if it makes a difference? it is because Dugin knows that Putin's mysticism does not come from him that he is so keen to anticipate Putin's mysticism as a way of building his own profile. He wants to run ahead of the carriage. Now to the ethics of talking to Mr. Dugin. Now, Ian Garner objected to the Spectator article by roughly pointing out that it dramatically whitewashed Dugin, that it sort of sanitized him by essentially omitting odious statements that Dugin has made about Ukraine, about the war. And I basically agree with Ian, but here is why. Dugin may be over-interviewed in the West because of this silly idea that he is Putin's brain. And the way that idea works, funnily enough, is that Dugin has more of a reputation in the West than he does in Russia. And he builds his reputation inside Russia by appealing to his reputation in the West. Funnily enough, that's how it works. So we often wonder, well, what does Dugin really mean in Russia? Well, actually, what he means in Russia is mostly the song and dance that happens around him in the West that then is transferred in a sort of self-legitimizing way back into Russia. What Dugin does have are good contacts. He has a very, very strong network with all kinds of people, some of them very unlovely, in European politics, in Turkish politics, in Middle Eastern politics. He knows a lot of people. So he's perhaps over-interviewed in the West, but it is not wrong to interview Dugin. Any issue that arises with is with how the interview is done, not with whether you do the interview. So there is an editorial responsibility to present Dugin's view on the war without sanitizing it. I am extraordinarily grateful for this conversation. I'm increasingly uncertain around what I would call not entirely consistent and transparent regulations about what one is advised to avoid saying on this platform. And that's why I am concerned to repeat many of the things Dugin has said, because what often happens is that the automated process ends up assuming that you're saying them from yourself. But that's just to give you an indication of how extreme his statements are, that there's the sorts of statements that if one made from oneself, as it were, one would be in trouble everywhere, perhaps except on Twitter. So it's not wrong to interview Dugin. It's about how you do it, but there is a responsibility to not sanitize him, and there are only two exceptions to that responsibility. The first is if you're very confident that the general reader will know the context, will know the bad things Dugin has been up to. But Dugin is just not well enough known for that, so you need that context. It's not like you're writing about Trump, where, or some extraordinarily famous, where you can assume people have a rough sense of their bio. The other circumstance is if you're talking to Dugin about pop music or Heidegger, where it's still a matter of a judgment call, but there's much less pressure to, give context to his position on the war, if that's not what the interview is about. But this interview was about geopolitics and the Ukraine war, and it did omit defining and unlovely aspects of Dugin's position on it. But then why interview him at all? Why not just dismiss him as an odious character and an unimportant intellectual? Because editorially, you can judge Dugin's odiousness, but not his talent. Whether Dugin has philosophical talent is itself a philosophical question that you might have some intuitions about as an editor, but you shouldn't, in fact, judge it. You should just assume that there's a wide gamut and you're going to talk to a lot of people who, in fact, have nothing to contribute, but you just don't know. And you're going to talk to a lot of people who have a lot to contribute, and you'll mislabel them, you'll miscategorize them. So in a world in which great talent is at best recognized retrospectively, the results of only interviewing thinkers we think are important would be disastrous. It is shocking, beautiful community, how many requests to comment I get on Dugin. And I avoid it nearly all the time. But there may be in 2024 a general Dugin video on the main channel. Just because of that volume of curiosity. All of that curiosity is actually coming from people who, are entirely pro-Ukrainian and despise the Putin regime, but they're just curious. And you can see the fascination. But you can also see the sort of the pitfalls of wishful thinking and fantasy that we can project onto Dugin's figure. But if you have any questions for me about Dugin, drop them in the comments, because I'll be coming back to this video in the future when I'm making a main channel video about Dugin, and I'll be very keen to know what questions or issues or concerns about this character or the way he is received you have on your mind. Thank you so much for surviving this. Talk very soon. Lots of love.